Well, hello, everyone. Russell Goodman, Supply Chain Brain Senior Editor here, welcoming you to Gartner's continuing series, 5 Keys to Unlocking Supply Chain Value in a Time of Crisis. The title for today's program, Enhance Supply Chain Risk Management to Increase Resilience. Just want to remind you that a Q&A session will follow the presentation today. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box on your screen as the program unfolds. Our presenter today will address as many questions as possible before we sign off, but not to worry. Any questions still pending, she will get to offline. All right, it's no secret that the last 3 years or so have witnessed an increasing number of supply chain disruptions. Recent Gartner research shows that the risk environment is continuing to evolve. So it's equally important, vitally important, to be better prepared for disruptions. To be effective, supply chain leaders must position risk management as a business enabler. Well, that means developing and building on risk capability, finding your risk strategy, and identifying, prioritizing, mitigating, and monitoring supply chain risks proactively. I'm confident that you will leave today's session with a comprehensive understanding of the linkage between risk management and resilience, a greater understanding of risk management strategies, shape disruption and respond to risk, and a firm grasp on ways to build on your risk management capability to enhance your risk response. I just want to remind you that coming up is the all-important Gartner Supply Chain Symposium, first in Orlando, June 6th through the 8th, and then in September, from the 27th through the 29th, London will be hosting this important gathering, the most important gathering of supply chain executives in the world. There is no better place for networking and learning in the supply chain space. You definitely do not want to miss this. So register today. You can do that at gartner.com/conf/SC. Well, to walk us through this all-important area today, I'm delighted to say it's Heather Wheat, Senior Director and Analyst at Gartner. You know, for more than 25 years, Heather has worked in risk roles in such organizations as the Ministry of Defense in the UK, Johnson Matthey, and at Tesco. So I think it's fair to say that Heather has a passion for showing how proactive risk management increases stakeholder value, enhances agility, and it helps you deliver on the goals you've set in your organization. By the way, Heather will be at the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium conferences coming up in Orlando and in London. Again, you want to register for that as soon as possible. Okay, and now to our presentation and to Heather Wheatley of Gartner. Heather, welcome.
Thank you so much for that welcome, Russell. Much appreciated. And thank you to the Supply Chain Brain team for inviting me along to present to you today. As Russell said, right, risk management is certainly a hot topic, and I think it will continue to be for some time. So let me just take you through the agenda for today's session. So firstly, I'm going to talk with you about the relationship between risk and resilience. They're 2 buzzwords that we are constantly talking about right now. I'll outline some of the risks that we've experienced in the past several years and the impact this is having on our supply chains. I'll then talk to you about why we need to move forward with risk management. Next, I'll talk to you through some strategies that you can use to think about risk. This includes shaping the amount of risk that is hitting us and then responding well to the risks that do. And finally, then, I'll talk you through some areas where we are seeing our clients enhancing their risk processes, enhancing their capabilities to help them ensure optimum risk responses. So let's start here then with risk management and resilience. And resilience has been the buzzword, right, of the past several years. And you can't go anywhere without people talking about being resilient and getting more resilient. And indeed, many of my clients are telling me that they have board level direction to be more resilient and get more resilience. But what does this mean? And actually, how does it relate to risk? Our starting point should be risk. What could happen that might impact our ability to deliver our strategy, our objectives, and our goals? We can then build resilience to help us meet those goals. So, in effect, when we talk about resilience, what we simply mean here is better control for risk, whether it be proactive in terms of having solutions up front to reduce the likelihood of risks occurring, or indeed reactive, having controls in place to mitigate the impacts of risk when they occur. And both risks and resilience go hand in hand and should be treated almost as two sides to that same coin. But what risks do we need resilience for? And what I'd like to do is I'd like to set the scene for why we need to move the dial on risk management and resilience. So what can I say about the past few years? It's been like nothing we have ever experienced in our lives. And I think you'll all agree with me that it has been a bumpy old ride. The sheer number and scale of disruptions has been absolutely immense. We've had environmental risks, including wildfires, floods, freezes, and even earthquakes. We've had geopolitical risks, right, including trade wars, sanctions, elections, and of course, the one that's top of mind for many right now, the war in Ukraine. And overlaid on this, we've had the risks that we never thought we would encounter. And these include the blockage in the Suez Canal, a gas crisis now here in Europe, and of course, COVID-19. And 75% of our clients tell us that they are experiencing more high impact, unfamiliar risks than 3 years ago. And 68% of our clients tell us that they are constantly responding to high impact risk events for which they weren't prepared. 67% of our clients say that they haven't finished dealing with one event before the next one has hit them. And, I would take a moment here to reflect on whether you are in this 68 and 67%, whether you feel that you're constantly responding to high impact events, and whether you feel that you don't have insufficient time to recover. And think about whether you need to move that dial in terms of risk management. It's important to reflect, though, that, whilst we've been dealing with these unfamiliar high impact risk events, we've also been dealing with those familiar risks that we've endured through supply chain for decades. This now means that we've actually got risks on two levels. We've got unfamiliar high impact events and then a constant stream of more familiar risks. And what our research tells us is that this situation is not going to stop anytime soon. And risk events are also becoming more costly. And here you have data on your screen about the average payout to insured per natural disasters. And what you can see here is that this has increased by 2.5 times nearly since 2006. And just to give you some fairly scary statistics here, in the US, there was 20 separate billion-dollar weather events. That's in 1 year. And the total damage of these was estimated as $145 billion. That is not an insignificant amount of money, and not all of it was insured. There's also, though, an increase in cost to serve after disruption, which we know from our research goes up by 4% after the disruptions. And I would absolutely love to say to you all on the line today that it goes up by 4% and then back down again. But in many cases, it just does not. with this backdrop, then, what are the challenges to risk management right now? And I'd put to you then to reflect again on whether your current risk management approach is reactive. Is it proactive? And indeed, is it effective? And just some key data for you on this. 43% of organizations are not working to a risk appetite. And at organizational level, this is super, super interesting. And if you haven't thought about risk appetite, have you thought about how much risk and therefore resilience is acceptable to you and your organization? And then a question of when and where do we stop putting in place more resilience? And only a third of organizations are mapping those interdependencies between risks. And what this means is that risks are often created and then managed in silos. And one end of the supply chain organization or the wider ecosystem is creating risks which are then felt elsewhere. And then let's look at the lessons learned. So staggeringly, less than 40% of organizations are learning the lessons from past crises. So we are not using this information to its full potential. And what this is doing is it's stopping us from having an optimum risk response the next time a risk that's similar materializes. So then when I view about the effectiveness of response, I kind of see it on a continuum. And we're often quite good at the horizon scanning element. So, you can ask your leaders and they can often tell you what's top of mind for them, what they think the risks are. But where we are less robust is assessing the impact, formally deciding whether we are comfortable with the risk and then whether we need to mitigate more. And we're less robust still regarding crisis simulations. And these are some of the areas where we need to strengthen our risk management and move the dial in terms of our thinking.
Today's webinar is brought to you by barcoding. Security is paramount in your path to digital transformation. Barcoding can help. We are the right partner for your mobile device management, giving you peace of mind that your devices, applications, functionalities, updates, and more are optimized and secure 24/7, 365. Schedule your consultation at barcoding.com. And by GEP. GEP delivers transformative supply chain solutions that help global enterprises become more agile and resilient, operate more efficiently and effectively, gain competitive advantage, boost profitability, and increase shareholder value. Headquartered in Clark, New Jersey, GEP has offices and operations centers across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. To learn more, visit gep.com.
With this challenge in mind, then, I'd like to now take you through a couple of ways that organizations are viewing risk. And there's basically two main strategies that organizations employ. Each has its place and each is important as the other. And optimum risk management employs both of these. So let's consider first a risk strategy where you shape your disruption. And I am super proud to give you an overview of a fabulous piece of research on this and show you how organizations are using this strategy to design out risk. It's super important, though, that whatever strategy you are putting in place, that you are counting the costs of disruption. And this gives you a true baseline of what extra costs you are having when risks materialize. It also gives you a measure of how good your response is when it materializes. And information for counting the cost of disruption comes from a number of different sources. you can use asset downtime costs or inventory relocation costs, expedited shipping, for example, overtime costs, rework, staff reallocation, supplier continuity costs. The the list of costs is probably bigger than you imagine. And I do appreciate that these costs can be held in multiple locations in an organization and that it might take you a little bit of time to complete, but it is well worth the discussion and well worth the exercise. Do you know how much you are spending on risk today? So our research then, in terms of shaping disruption, I'd like to kind of walk you through it and why we did it. So when we talked to organizations, what we found was that their common response for risk management was to, in the main, always try and reduce the impact of disruption. And we typically do this in three ways. So we think about resilience, which is the ability to resist, absorb, and then recover from an event, and in a way that minimizes that negative impact. Then we look at agility, which is all about sensing and responding quickly to a disruption to reduce that negative impact. And then visibility, access to transparent, accurate, timely, and complete plans, for example. And the vast majority of organizations that we talked to were employing these three techniques hand in hand. But in a world of continued high impact disruptions, what we found was that organizations were rapidly running out of options. So think back to that slide I showed you right at the beginning of the presentation with all of those disruptions over the past few years. How many options do you have left for dealing with disruption? And we within Gartner call this group of organizations that are focusing on reducing the impact of disruption, we call them disruption responders. And their aim is to reduce the impact, and it assumes that that disruption is going to happen anyway. But there is another way to think about risk. What if I said to you that the disruption didn't have any impact on you or your organization whatsoever? What if it flew straight past you? Through our research, what we found was a group of organizations that were experiencing less than 1/3 of the high impact disruptions than those that were simply employing a response strategy. So those that were only employing resilience, agility, and visibility were experiencing 7 more high impact disruptions per year than their peers who were employing a different strategy. Think about this. If you are experiencing less disruption, then the strategies you have in place for resilience are more likely to work more effectively for the disruptions that you do have. And I'm sure now you're all sitting in front of your screens wondering how on earth they're doing that. After all, you can't stop the freeze, the election, the trade wars, or the hurricanes. So let me show you what they do. What our disruption shapers do is that they consider and implement changes to their supply chain surface area. And their supply chain surface area is made up of 2 factors, movement and footprint factors. And movement factors include the processes across the product life cycle, for example, sales channels, 3PLs, shipping modes, footprint factors, and suppliers at tier 2 and below. And also, though, internal and external manufacturing sites. And what our disruption shapers do is that they design their supply chain surface area so that they reduce in these areas. But what they do is they do this mindfully. They consider the risk to serve of each change and they design out risk. So we are not simply considering cost to serve, we are thinking about risk to serve. And the premise of our research here is that the bigger your surface area, so the more products you have, the more sales channels, 3PLs, shipping modes, suppliers, factories, manufacturing sites, the more of these that you have, the bigger your surface area, and the more likely you are to suffer a high impact unfamiliar risk. So those organizations that have employed a disruption response strategy, what they have done is they've inadvertently increased their supply chain surface area. And this is what is leading to more and more high impact disruptions. And it's important to say at this point that these organizations, right, whether you're a shaper or a responder, are still pursuing the same strategic objectives. They still want to manage their risks. They still want to optimize costs, and they still want to innovate and meet customer expectations. And they do this better because they're experiencing less disruption. So what's the outcome of this strategy then? I call this slide my full tank of readiness slide. And picture yourself in January, you've had the holidays, and you've got a full tank of readiness, and you're ready and raring to go. And each point on this chart represents a disruption. In orange for our disruption responders, and blue for our shapers. And what happens following each disruption is that actually it takes us time to get us back up and running to full capacity, a full tank of readiness. By month 12, our responders, so those that are only employing resilience, agility, and visibility, have experienced so many disruptions that they've used up every bit of gas in their tank of readiness. Whereas our shapers are well prepared to deal with the next disruption because their tank is fuller, quicker. And they've done this because they've optimized their supply chain surface area. And this delta, what this does is it represents your competitive advantage. And if you haven't already, I'd strongly suggest that you think about pursuing this as a long-term strategy for risk management. With this in mind, though, there's always a need for a risk response strategy, because no matter how much disruption we shape, there will always be some sort of disruption. And I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides a few ways in which organizations are thinking about this. So first and foremost, then, we need to embed risk management to build that agility, visibility, and resilience. And what this does is we need to prioritize these activities, and we need to embed them in our organizational culture and design. And we should actively consider at this point how we can influence both the likelihood and the impact of risks. And our starting point is identifying risks that impact the supply chain. And this includes risks that are created by the supply chain operations and risks that are created in other areas of the business, and also risks that are created externally. And we talk about that in a minute. Interdependencies need to be recognized and the ownership of risks assigned. You need to decide organizational risk appetite, because this ensures understanding of the amount of risk that we are comfortable taking. On the right-hand side of the slide there, risk responses can be considered of whether they affect, again, that likelihood or impact, and decisions taken in terms of whether what we are doing in terms of our current strategies of risk are sufficient. We need to recognize, and I'm a realist, that it's impractical and cost prohibitive to mitigate every risk down to the lowest possible level. And given the visibility of supply chain operations in our current risk environment, we should use this as an opportunity to escalate risks and gain further leadership support. We need to further embed our responses and embed them in our operating model. And then this becomes business as usual for our organizations. And finally, in the middle of the slide, what you need to do and what I want you to do is seek assurance on your ability to respond to risks. How do you know that the controls or resilience that you have in place is effective? How do you know that your risk responses will work? Another way that organizations are thinking about this is that they are anchoring their risk processes around their concept of criticality. So they're in effect making a decision about what is important to you as an organization and what you need to protect most. They're then thinking about key risk areas. So, for example, geopolitical, operational, environmental, financial, for example, and they're mapping these to their portfolio. And once they've done this, then they're identifying risk mitigations, both proactive, so the things that we can do up front before a risk materializes, and then also reactive for after that event takes place. Then thinking about the concept of risk appetite again, where appropriate, they are implementing further mitigations or resilience. And then we're also testing our plans and playbooks to make sure that they work. Finally, in this stage, then, we are monitoring our risks. And this is super important. So we're thinking about what is changing. And many organizations are purchasing risk management solutions to help them with this. And what is needed here is to support good governance around alerts. And I'm smiling here when I think of an inbox with 300 alerts all at once. What governance you need is to define those trigger points for when a risk is within tolerance and what happens if it's not. And by doing this, they focus risk management on resilience on the things that matter most. And this is a super effective solution when you do not have an endless resources to mitigate every single risk that we might encounter everywhere in our organization.
Today's webinar is also brought to you by Parcel. Supply chains today are in crisis. Before companies can strengthen their supply chain, however, they need to understand it. Before insurers can provide better coverage, they need better data to inform underwriting and claims. A data-powered insurer for essential supply chains. Parcel redefines insurance for perishable goods by using granular supply chain data to identify and manage risk, resulting in best-in-class insurance coverage rates you can afford. Learn more at parcel.com. And by Vecna Robotics. Vecna Robotics is an intelligent material handling technology company engineered to keep goods moving. Our award-winning autonomy solutions choreograph flexible, uninterrupted work between autonomous mobile robots, labor, facilities, and systems with 24/7, 365 command center monitoring, proprietary obstacle avoidance, and always-on machine learning. To keep your supply chain running safely and bring your distribution, warehousing, or manufacturing operations into the future, visit vecnarobotics.com. Don't forget to join us at the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium in Orlando, June 6th through the 8th, or in London, September 27th through 29th. There is no better supply chain forum. Register today at Gartner.com.
Thank you so much, Russell. So finally for today then, I'm going to look at some of the capabilities that organizations are employing to strengthen their risk response. So what they're doing kind of behind the scenes in order to make sure that their risk management activities work as well as they possibly can do. So let's just first look though at some data, and this is really recent data from us on a survey that we have done just at the end of last year. And what this shows is that 65% of organizations are saying to us that they want to be more proactive and better prepared for risk. And then when we look at those bigger organizations with more employees, 79% of organizations say they want to do this better. There's a smaller proportion, that say we're going to make some changes, but their focus will revert to traditional priorities. And then there's that group at the bottom whereby they're saying their approach will continue to be reactive and focused on kind of managing through the fog, through disruption events as they happen. I would put to you that those organizations that are going to be most successful will be those that are more proactive and better prepared for disruption. Okay, so if you're in that 17% box, I would strongly suggest that you aim to move yourself up to the 65% category there. So what sort of things are we doing then in terms of our capability for risk? What are we doing to be more prepared? Well, firstly, I'd like to just kind of take a little step back here and draw a distinction regarding issues and risks. And within organizations, we can tie ourselves up in knots about this. Issues are things that we are dealing with right now. We should be in the middle of our response. And risks are future events, whereby we go through a methodical process to identify and determine mitigations. We implement them to bring that risk down to an acceptable level. And we should be doing things like scenario planning to help us determine response. We shouldn't be in the middle of the scenario and figuring out what the response is at that point in time. Now, the way that you can move your organization, because if you ask people what their risks are, they will just tell you their issues. And it happens time and time again. So the way to move people on this is to use a very small but effective phrase. And that's the then phrase. So if an event happens, then these may well be the consequences. And you can use that cost of disruption slide that I showed you earlier and think about those different costs to articulate what the costs might be. I'd also like, though, to take a little step back and highlight the risks that we experience within supply chain are super broad. And this is not just about supplier risk management. And we've got strategic level risks, and this might be our organizational design, our transformation, our mergers and acquisitions and divestitures, determining departmental objectives, for example. Then we have risks in our traditional functional areas. So with supplier management, manufacturing, logistics, planning, for example. And in these first two areas, so the delivery of our strategy and in the functional areas, we generally have quite a bit of control over how much risk is acceptable and what we're going to take. But I'd like you to reflect on whether you are thinking about those risks that are perhaps controlled by others. And here I'll highlight cybersecurity, which, if a risk materializes, has the ability to completely stop us operating. Think about here your inventory management system, your warehouse management system, ERP system, even your emails. This shutdown, if it happens, could go on for days, hopefully days, but even possibly months. And traditionally within supply chain, what we've done is we've left it to our technology and IT professionals to control this risk for us. But given the interconnectedness that we're working with our ecosystem partners, this risk is now increasing. So for these risks that are controlled by others, that are impacted in our area, so where we feel the impact, we need to pay more attention to them. We need to ask our colleagues in R&D and NPI and technology what they are doing to mitigate the risks that impact us. And this ensures that we can then determine mitigations and that we are well protected and can act quickly in an event. With this then in mind, how best to identify our risks? And at this point, I'd encourage you to cast the net super far and super wide regarding identification of risk. And again, risks should hang off your business strategy, your goals, and your objectives. And of course, we're pretty good actually at identifying risks within our normal supply chain functions. But are you drawing on the experience of other experts within your organization? So R&D, finance, marketing, sales, for example. And are you looking outside for your risks also? So thinking about customers, regulators, NGOs, They are all important sources of risk information. Do not overlook these, as risks will come from these areas also. They will also be able to help you with risk control and mitigation. Moving along then, I'd encourage you to think about how your governance for risk happens. So how you identify risk, where you identify risk, who you escalate risks to, and who is making decisions on risk about acceptability, for example. And what we see here is many organizations developing and setting up risk or resilience councils. And these can be really super helpful, both for providing oversight, directing deep dives on risk, and monitoring the effectiveness of risk response. Oftentimes, these risk councils will have both supply chain representatives and representatives from the wider business. And what this does is it helps us allow for the interconnectedness of risks to be identified to help us get to a better response. So are you having all of the players in the game in those meetings to discuss risk and response, or are you looking at risk in silos? Another way that we can move our capability and our thinking about risk is to move conversations away from simply what is the risk. And oftentimes within organizations, we spend a lot of time discussing the wording of the risk and wordsmithing it, when actually what is a better use of your time is to move that conversation to the back end of the risk register and think about the following things. What mitigating controls do we have for the risk today? So think about, what resilience do we have now? And then a pretty difficult question, but really a yes/no question. Given this risk, given the mitigating controls that I have today, am I comfortable with these existing mitigations, or is our organization comfortable with the existing mitigations? And the answer to that question is really yes or no. And then thinking about what further actions could we take? And this is almost like providing a menu of options here to say, for this risk, this is what we're doing today. We are not comfortable with it. And then we could do these 5 things, for example, to help us bring that risk down to a level that is acceptable to us. Now, we should also introduce a path to escalate and elevate risks. And if you don't have one, then formulating this and defining it and writing it down will be super, super useful for you. Within supply chain, we have never had the center stage like we have now. Supply chain disruptions and risks are front page news, and we need to use this and spotlight it right to our advantage and escalate those risks so that those that are senior within our organizations understand the risks that we are facing and also understand the mitigations we put in place. And what this does is it drives improvement and helps obtain support and buy-in for our mitigations and managing. And just a word on risk ownership. And why should we assign ownership for risk? Why should we do that? If you don't assign ownership, it becomes almost everybody and nobody. Somebody needs to be making decisions as to whether your controls are good enough for risk. And what you need your risk owners to do is plan further mitigations, oversee the implementation of these mitigations, monitor those risks, and help develop plans for which, if they materialize. Now, just a word on risk ownership. And often at risk meetings and risk discussions, we talk about risks without having the owners there. Introduce that accountability by having the risk owners being responsible for presenting their risks. I can assure you it will focus their minds in terms of response. But let's now just think about the implementation of further mitigations. And as you see here, so 39% of organizations say to us that investment costs are a barrier to making our supply chains more resilient. And the first thing you should do here is take a broader view of costs and think again about that counting the cost of disruption. Because if you count the cost of disruption, the discussion about investment costs becomes a whole lot easier. And I often get asked about what's the ROI of all of these investments, all of these mitigations, all of these resilience. And I would draw your attention to the benefits of resilience, which are on the right-hand side of the slide, which talks to, actually, we will protect revenue. We will have a shorter time to recover. Our customers will be satisfied. Yep, our stock price will stay high, for example, or not reduce. And indeed, we may well have reduced insurance costs throughout this process. And, if people really want to talk numbers, this is a way that you can focus their minds in terms of risk response. So the starting point is you are spending, I don't know, maybe $1 million on materialized risks. And people either don't want to pay for more mitigations, or they want you to wave a magic wand and reduce the risk down to the lowest possible level. Oftentimes, this isn't realistic or affordable. And having conversations with the wider business in terms they understand will help set expectations on how much control we want to put in place. So basically, do you want to move the impact of the risk from a kind of a medium impact to a low impact? And how much do we want to spend? Do you want to spend $200,000 or $500,000 at this point? And the benefit of talking to the wider business in these terms is that they actually can then understand what you're spending on disruption, understand what you want to spend on mitigation, and then take that decision about whether the level of risk you are holding is acceptable to you or not. Now, in terms of response, each supply chain function has a role to play in developing strategies and also executing on these. But it's equally important to note that building resilience and risk mitigation requires absolute cross-functional engagement. Firstly, within product design and development, and this is super important. And I'm smiling when I talk to some of my clients, because we're talking now about what raw materials are going into our products and how resilient are they at that starting point. And this sets you up for success. Then throughout our other activities, so planning, sourcing, procurement, quality, manufacturing, and logistics. And all of this, though, is increased within supply chain visibility, and it's underpinned by that. And think about your sourcing and your suppliers. And I'd like to ask you to ask yourselves another question. What visibility do you have throughout the tiers of your supply chain? And our research shows that visibility decreases as the tier level of the suppliers increases. So over half organizations have more than 90% visibility into their tier 1 suppliers, but 4%, yes, that's 4%, have less at all of the other tiers, okay? And the last thought I'll leave you with then, before I move on to some recommendations for you, is risk response strategies. And I'm sure when you look at this slide, many of you are focusing on these. Whether it be in the area of inventory or transportation alternatives, backup routes, backup suppliers, having standard platforms, for example, dual sourcing, and thinking about regionalization and globalization. So what I would suggest here is, though, yes, think about these, but also have an eye on what might be tomorrow's risks and what might emerge as we evolve our business. Think about things like sustainability, for example. Think about ecosystem collaboration, and think about actually what are the risk responses that we need to put in place for these newer risks, as well as those more familiar risks that we're used to dealing with, as well as those high impact risks. So in summary then, what I'd encourage you to reflect on and ask yourself the following questions. Are we as an organization employing both disruption shaping and risk response activities? So are we simply assuming that the risks are going to hit us and we've just got to mitigate them down to reduce the impact? Or can we design them out in the first place? Are you identifying and responding to all of the types of risks that may create an impact within our supply chains? And remember, super important to have an eye on those risks that we think are being managed by others. And finally, those areas of capability that we've just been through, and those governance techniques and the risk thinking, are you positioned now to define areas of capability that you have, and also areas that you can build on in order to enhance your risk management approach? Okay.
Absolutely tremendous drill down, Heather. Thank you so very much. But we're going to move on. We've got questions just flooding in right now, so we want to get to some of them and see what is on folks' minds. Let's just see. First question: how to best prepare an organization for potential capacity disruptions? Well, what would you say to that?
Oh my goodness. So in terms of capacity, then what we need to be looking at is so I would always start with the shaping disruption research, okay? And that best prepares us to minimize the likelihood of a risk happening in the future. And so I would be thinking about looking at what is most important to us, and thinking about, and this is cold hard fact, right? So thinking about what products and services do we need to have out the door, and focusing our risk mitigation efforts on those before we think about anything else. Organizations right now are making hard decisions on actually what they're going to produce, where they're going to produce it. And those hard decisions are driven by that criticality point. What is important to you to help you meet that strategy?
We have a question here that dealing with size, I suppose. The question is, does a smaller supply chain surface area still apply risk mitigation factors like dual sourcing? Well, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the way that we've seen organizations apply this technique is actually really super clever. So what organizations are doing is they're thinking about where their supply chain surface area can increase, and also then where they want it to stay the same. So I give you one example of an organization that we worked with, and basically what they've said is that they will increase the size of their supply chain surface area for the products and services that drive the majority of the revenue. And then for the other piece of the jigsaw, if you like, the other part of the organization, basically what they have said is that they will not increase the supply chain surface area for that. So when we think about dual sourcing, they'll think about, yep, we will dual source in those pieces of the jigsaw that drive the revenue, and we will increase the supply chain surface area slightly in those ones, but we will actually decrease it or make it stay the same for those areas that are not driving the revenue. So yes, it's kind of a bit of both approach there.
Heather, just to make sure that the audience fully understands, we have a follow-on question. Jason wants to know, what does smaller supply chain surface area mean? Does it mean reducing total suppliers?
Okay, so when we talk supply chain surface area, we talk about two main factors. We talk about movement factors and footprint factors. And in terms of our movement factors, what we have is the number of processes, for example, across the supply chain. We talk about the number of 3PLs and shipping modes. And we talk about kind of all the aspects that take the supply chain right through from production to delivery to customer, and almost the number of nodes between it. So how complex our processes are, how many different 3PLs, shipping modes, transport lanes, for example. And then we look at footprint factors, and footprint factors are associated with how many internal and external manufacturing sites we have, and also how many suppliers we have. And both of those together formulate our supply chain surface area. And in those factors, the organizations that are shaping their disruption are reducing all of those factors. So if you can imagine it like almost like a computer network with lots of different applications on that, lots of different computers and laptops and systems, the bigger and more complex your computer system is and your technology system is, the more likely you are to be hit by a cyber attack. And it's a very same principle. So the bigger and more complex your supply chain organization is, the more likely it is likely to be hit by a high impact disruption.
Well, thank you for that clarification. Next question. What methods are professionals in risk management utilizing to monitor risk factors, and how is that different for shapers?
So in terms of that question then, I don't think it's terrifically different, actually. I think it's just there's a slight nuance. So our disruption shapers are considering risk to serve when they're thinking about maybe putting in place a new manufacturing plant or applying a new supplier. And what they're doing is, instead of just looking at the financial and the cost aspects, they're thinking about risk in terms of political risk and environmental risk, for example, and geopolitical risk and financial risk and environmental risk. And what they're doing is they're saying, right, okay, when we're making decisions, we're going to make these in terms of risk-based decisions. On the flip side, though, everybody, whether it's a shaper or a responder, are now thinking about how can we monitor risks in terms of whether they're emerging, for example, or whether there's an event or an incident happening. So how do we know that the earthquake has happened in Japan, for example? And so organizations, whether it be either of those, are employing usually technology solutions in order to help them understand what risks might be bubbling up, for example, in the political space, or what has happened in terms of events. But it doesn't matter really whether you're a shaper or a responder, you still need to do both of those efforts.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here dealing with centralization. The question is, how have you seen companies that are decentralized handling this as compared to their counterparts in centralized organizations? Well, how would you answer that?
Yeah, so in terms of this then, so decentralized organizations in terms of risk are, they're not struggling and they're not finding it harder, they're just finding it different. I suppose the point in centralized organizations is that it is easier to understand the full picture of risk. Decentralized organizations tending to have more disparate risk silos, if you like. But indeed, what I am starting to see within organizations, or what we do see, are risk centers of excellence or strategy centers of excellence that are pulling this together for those decentralized organizations so that we don't have anything that falls through the gaps.
You know, Heather, these are some tremendous information, but we are vastly running out of time here. So let's just go to our final question. And I think it's a good one. It's someone is asking, if I were to do one thing, a single thing today to move the dial in terms of risk and resilience, well, what would that one thing be? Well, give them some advice. What would you tell them?
So I think we need to get better at helping organizations see the return on investment for risk and resilience. Counting the cost of disruption is a fantastic place to start. This then helps us decide where to focus our risk response, and then think about risks in terms of what might materialize and how much it costs us. From that point then, we can think about those activities, products and services that are most important to us and most important to your organization. And from that counting of cost of disruption basis, we can work with our partners in the supply chain ecosystem to identify risks, the ways in which we're currently mitigating them, and then have those conversations about what else we can do to mitigate those risks. From that point then, with all that kind of numbers and thoughts in mind, we can determine what level of risk we're comfortable with and what future mitigations we put in place. And this way, we put our time and our effort into managing those risks that matter the most to us, what is going to stop us meeting our objectives. And we reduce the overall impact on our organizations. In this way, what I'd leave our people with here is that we can continue to utilize risk management and continue for supply chain to support successful organizations. So thank you.
What a valuable drill down. Highly useful information. But I'm afraid that we're going to have to leave it there. That's just simply all the time that we have today. Folks, I just want to remind you that any questions we did not get to today, Heather will answer them offline. All right, then. Many thanks to Heather Wheatley of Gartner for sharing her time and expertise with us today. I want to thank Gartner itself. A big thanks to you, each one of you, for attending today. And listen, as a reminder, join us, join Heather, and in Orlando, June 6th through 8th for the 2022 Gartner Supply Chain Symposium, or in London, September 27th through the 29th. You do not want to miss this, so register today. So long, everybody.